Hi, Luke Andreski. Hi, Mark Dodd. How are you both?
Hi,
Um,
Jason. Very nice to be with you.
yeah, very good to meet you as well. Been a long time. Looking forward to this.
Welcome to 10 by 6. Today, we're going to look at the nature of ethical businesses. And Mark's going to kick us off with a question I suspect a lot of people are asking. So over to you, Mark.
So the question I have comes out of life experience, really, and that is, I'm a publican by background and involved in trying to make the pub sector a fairer place. And I set up a campaign called the Fair Play Campaign in 2006, which lobbied the government to end the beer tie, which most pubs in Britain are operated under. Pub companies own large numbers of pubs. They lease them to individuals under a tied lease. The tied lease means that the beer supplies and other supplies are the tenants of the pubs are obliged to buy their supplies through the pub companies' supply chains, and the pub companies are able to charge up to double open market prices. They can basically control the wholesale price of beer through that. And I became victim of that in a very busy pub I had in South East London called the Sun and Doves. And a combination of the rent and the excessive beer prices led to my business failing and to me being evicted and homeless for 3 years and a whole load of other consequences. And this is why the pub sector is failing. And as a result of that, I thought it would be a very good idea to come up with a business model that would be a pub company that actually invested in pubs for all the right reasons to encourage them to thrive. And I started investigating a way of finding a means of legal and governance that would make that embed that in the business ethos of the company. So I proposed the idea for a company, and have spent 12, 13 years trying to find a means of having an ethical business model to found it in. And what seemed to be a no-brainer idea in 2011, when this People's Pub Partnership was registered at Companies House to preserve the name, has turned into a long journey trying to persuade all manner of legal solicitors, people involved in governance all over the landscape in Britain, to help establish a multi-stakeholder ownership business model where no one can profit more than anybody else. And it seems to be an almost impossible task. Sorry, that's a bit long-winded, but it's a very simple thing. It turns out to be incredibly complicated, and it's largely because everybody believes that somebody's got to make a load of money.
Knowing the background and context is absolutely vital. Now, Luke, you've written extensively on the nature of ethical businesses. So can you help Mark?
I think that Mark probably has more experience than I have in attempting to put this into practice. So in a lot of my work is fairly theoretical, and I think from the sounds of what you've just described, you've already taken some of that theory, i.e. the idea of being an ethical business that nurtures its employees and nurtures its customers, and has a egalitarian approach to sharing both the service and the value that you gain from running a business. So I mean, it sounds as if you've been trying to apply that or find ways of applying it in our current incredibly materialistic and commercially orientated society, and hit numerous obstacles.
Excuse me, you're absolutely spot on. The issue is that I regarded the tied pub sector, which is roughly half of the number of pubs in Britain. It's slightly less than that, but it's roughly half, are operated under this model as a microcosm of disaster capitalism, basically, because it's designed. Essentially, the freeholder is able to control the business of all of its lessees by being bigger, more powerful, and stronger in every level of the relationship. But so the rents inexorably increase, irrespective of market conditions, and the supply prices incrementally increase as well, according to the whim of the freeholder. And the tenants don't ever really get a chance to do anything other than run faster, work harder to make their business more successful in order to meet the demands of the freeholder. So that means corners get cut everywhere. The business itself ends inevitably, in my view. It's the end. The end of that that relationship is that the lessee's business will fail, and then they go out of business, and the pub still remains owned by the freeholder. New lessees come along, take on the pub, believing they can make it work really well. They invest some time and energy and money in it initially, and then their business fails. And eventually, once so many businesses have been churned through the pub, that the pub is really run down and no longer fit for purpose as a public house, the pub company says, well, all these entrepreneurial people have come to take on this pub, and unfortunately, they've all proven that there's not enough business anymore. Our habits have changed, and we just have to face the unpleasant reality that the pub needs to be sold for alternative use. Meanwhile, there's a community around that pub who just wants a great pub to go to, and if they had a great pub to go to, the pubs would not be failing. And the sum of it is that so my disaster capitalism microcosm idea is that ultimately all these pubs will go. And in the last 12 or 13 years, roughly 10,000 of the Tide pubs have closed and have been turned to alternative use. And it seems to be and it is an inexorable process whereby. I learned from my experience as a Tide publican that this is what's going on all over the planet, everywhere, and it's largely why we've got runaway climate crisis. Because the people in charge of the business at that level, the freeholders here, see no downside to continuing operating their business the way they do, which is essentially totally without ethics whatsoever. It's purely based on profit, and it's socially damaging. I mean, in pubs, it is literally directly socially damaging because communities lose their opportunity to meet each other locally, and the pub companies think they're doing a great job. It's completely counterintuitive. And when, yeah. Sorry, that's about it really. It's completely counterintuitive.
You described that incredibly well and with great, really articulately, and I think describing it as disaster capitalism is spot on. And I've been smiling while you were saying that, not out of any sense of pleasure at all, but out of the deep irony of seeing this model or this pattern as something which is repeated throughout society. So it's not just pubs. Yeah. It's what they're doing effectively. These freeholders are creating a little monopoly for themselves. So each one is a monopoly to which you, as the pub, as the person running the pub, or as the person trying, or even as the customer, you have no alternative. You are in their little. It's sort of like a fiefdom.
It's entirely feudal.
Yeah, very feudal. That's the word I was searching for. But we're seeing this kind of asset stripping mentality. So what they're doing, in the way you described it, is they're asset stripping probably one family after another who are coming in, or one couple after another who are coming in and trying to run these pubs. Yeah. They're asset stripping them of their time, some of their money, sometimes all of their money.
Well, yeah, many. Yeah.
And of their very hours of their life. But we see that everywhere. We see this monopoly culture, this kind of, well, it's a rentierism, isn't it?
It is.
We see it everywhere. We see it in all the big monopolies that this government has created in the water, in our water providers, in our energy providers, and in the big food companies. They're all seeking to create monopolistic conditions where they can asset strip their customers, basically, or their assets. They're asset stripping their customers, their employees, and the very businesses in which they operate.
Absolutely,
it's extraordinary.
And what I find really, I mean, it's not funny. It essentially, this has ruined my life. I was bankrupted. I was homeless for 3 years, and I'm currently on universal credit. And which is largely because I've spent the last 10 years devoting myself to try to overturn this model, and I do believe it is possible, but it's contingent upon on establishing a legal framework that is simple to understand, that everyone can relate to, that excludes the need for high net worth individual investment or institutional investment that is just rapacious, on the grounds that pubs are worth saving for all the reasons we I think largely understand, that they're good for social well-being, community health, and all kinds of other stuff. and leaving alcohol out of the issue. We're hypersocial creatures who really thrive by having good opportunities to meet other people, and you know, there's a huge amount of experience I've got that goes into these statements I'm making now, and some people find them a bit odd and contradictory. But basically, pubs are about people; they're not about alcohol. All that stuff's just kind of ancillary to the purpose of the pub, which is good fellowship. It's what they're about. And
a cultural entity.
No, absolutely, and we have they're unique to Britain in this form because of our own history, to do with the Reformation and all kinds of stuff to do with Puritanism and all that blah blah blah. And it's very deep. The pub is deeply embedded in our cultural DNA. And if you cut away all of the ifs and buts about their places for people to go and drown their sorrows, they promote poor health, which all these things are true. Well-run pubs don't allow that to happen. Well-run pubs are all about fostering good community. And while there is a hint in the ownership of these pub companies because they're largely backed by hedge funds, so they are inevitably extractive. And if the company accounts over the last 20 years of these businesses are looked at, and the transactions of purchasing pubs, selling pubs, intercompany transactions, is quite clear. What I'm saying is quite clear, that it's all about reducing the numbers of pubs, making profit by any means possible, and damn the outcome. And Britain has a culture of deeply embedded social capital built up in the pub, and I contend that a lot of the fractures, problems we've got in society now are partly a result of pubs being attacked like this invisibly. And ultimately, we are gaslighted by the pub companies by them saying, well, you stop going to the pub, our habits have changed, we have to close the pubs. And this is the cultural consciousness we have now, because that narrative has been pumped out for the last 20 years to excuse this extractive process of rentier capitalism that's applied to pubs. And we are busy people. And when we think, oh, I'd really love to have a great pub at the end of my street, it's a shame that pub isn't, and I don't go there anymore. We think, well, it's failed because we stopped going to it. But actually, we stopped going to the pub when it became a rundown place that was irrelevant to us, that was uncomfortable to go to, that normal people wouldn't enjoy going to anyway. And unless you have that conversation as an individual out there, and millions of people have this conversation face to face with somebody who's got quite a lot of experience with this kind of stuff, who then says, well, would you go to that pub if it was a really good pub? They always go, well, yes, of course I would. And that belies the entire lie. And we all feel pubs are failing immutably because of just the state of the world, but it's not. It's because of this hidden in plain sight rentier capitalism, which is all of this stuff is hidden in plain sight.
I'd like to say two things immediately. First, I consider you a hero for the battle you fought. I can't express my admiration. The sacrifice you've made to try to find a decent way to run something that's so important to you, and that you feel so strongly about. I really admire you for that.
Thank you.
Secondly, I'd like to say that everything you describe is just a microcosm of the awful predicament in which our society and our culture has placed itself through its obsession with commerce, with extractive systems, and with making profits. And so, you could say much of what you said, you could say about libraries or post offices, or decent small little local restaurants, or even fish and chip shops. All the things that are being squeezed and crushed, all the shops we're seeing boarded up in the high street.
Yeah.
They're all being crushed and destroyed by this rentier capitalism that we've been talking about.
And the irony is, even if they can't, if the rentiers can't get them directly, the energy companies do.
Can I intercede here and just summarize what we've had so far? So we've got this idea, this sort of fiefdom monopolization that's taking place, in which the landlords, for want of a better phrase, have most of the power, and those who are leaseholding from these landlords are the ones that come in with high expectations, a lot of hope, this self-belief that they can be successful but in most cases what we're finding is that they're being squeezed and eventually driven out. So we have this sort of cycle of failure.
Yeah.
So that's the empirical reality of this sort of post-industrial late capitalist phase. What now are the solutions? Because as I'm sitting here thinking about it, if we're going to create this ethical model, are pop-up pubs, for example, a way forward, or do we need to be looking at something a bit more sophisticated?
Well, I think it's something which is quite sophisticated, which is based in what pubs have always been, and that is these pubs that fail tend. There are always exceptions, of course, because it's a very varied reality. But these pubs that fail tend to have been purpose built, and have been they were built in places where there was a decent sized community that needed to be served with a pub. Those pubs tend to have a whole load of things like function rooms, a kitchen. They're very flexible. They might not have done food all the time, but they were designed to be flexible places to do cradle to grave service to local communities. And when those pubs fail, ironically enough, very often you find there are micro pubs have set up locally, one or two, and they're typically in shop units that are nothing to do with the traditional pub setup, and they can be very good pubs in themselves, but they're not full service pubs. They're just a room that serves beer, and it can be great beer and it can do a really good thing, but they're a very, very tiny segment of the market. So
but wouldn't a lot of them suggest to the corporate chains that their model is failing because more and more people are going to an alternative? Is the alternative something that we really, really need in order to squeeze the capitalist class in this sense?
Yeah, I think the whole thing's presented as micro pubs are a solution to the pubs crisis, but the pubs crisis is never analysed at a big level. And the big level is if you take one of the pubs that's failed, that means there's maybe a need for a micro pub nearby, which then, in a sense, solves the problem. If that pub were turned into a great pub again, there would be no need for a micro pub, and that pub would serve far more people in a more profound way than a micro pub is able to. And
so how do we get to that point then, Luke? How do we create the normative now?
It sounds to me as if what we're searching for. First of all, I'll say there's going to be no easy answer because, as we've seen, Mark's been searching for one and fighting for one for a long time, and we live in a society that doesn't look to help these sorts of solutions. But what immediately springs to mind is that we really need something that's more like a community-owned cooperatives.
Yeah.
But again, how do you set those up with our lack of trust that exists in the society? How do you get people to trust you enough to buy into or to buy a share in a business that needs actually quite a lot of investment? So you have to have a significant community. You have to have a community with a little spare capital, able to participate in setting up something like a pub and run it as a cooperative. But our entire society works against that. The absence of trust, the focus on personal profit, the lack of cooperation between individuals to achieve goals for the community.
Yeah.
All those things are lacking or breaking down in our society rather than building up. So you set yourself quite a task there, Mark, in trying to fight for something that requires not just a transition in the pub industry, but a transition in the way ordinary people are now thinking about their own lives and how they cooperate with one another.
No, I absolutely agree, and you've summed that up really well, Luke. There is a fundamental breakdown of trust at every level in society, everywhere, and I think I would contend that some of this is to do with the lack of contacts through pubs. I don't want to overstate that by mistake, but it's not provable, I don't think. But the principle is, I think people understand now, after a long period of this attrition to the pub sector, that we're really missing pubs. And for example, in government, when there's an early day motion proposed about, please Chancellor, cut duty on beer because we want to have pubs to be saved. No beer duty cut ever saves a pub because the brewers take all the beer duty advantage. So there's a kind of red herring, weird one there. But they're always the most well-attended meetings, cross-party, and all the politicians, quite genuinely, I'm not suggesting there's any kind of inauthenticity about this. They've got stories from their local constituency about the value of pubs to community and how important they are. excuse me, and then I just suddenly lost this thread. Yes, so the lack of yes, and the government has noticed over decades the value of pubs to community. This is not good. I'm just going to stop that. I didn't anticipate that. Sorry. So
we didn't say anything.
Oh, there was a call came in. Sorry. With the Localism Act in 2012, the Tories anticipated the need for communities to take back control of their local area, and so they made assets of community value a thing, and a community can identify a property that's under threat of loss that they regard as value to themselves, and pubs, and it was intended for libraries or anything really, and then pubs have become the most taken up asset of community value label in Britain. There are hundreds of pubs that have been listed as assets of community value. When that pub is sold, if a freeholder wants to sell that, intends to sell that pub, there's a 6-month moratorium placed on the sale, and the community group that nominated the asset then have an opportunity to put a business plan together, raise some capital, and try and buy the pub for community use. And quite a lot of grant money was put into this system, and it's developed a community pubs movement, which is laudable, and it does a good job. And every time a community does save its pub, it's a fantastic thing, gets loads of column inches, but the scale of it is such that roughly 13,000 pubs have closed since, say, around 2010, and
that's a shocking number.
It's a huge number. This is forever, and around 150 have been saved that way. And now the individual way of saving a pub like that is that there's not intrinsically anything wrong with it on a pub by pub basis or community basis, but what you were touching on earlier, Luke, about raising the finance, and it's a high bar to expect communities to save the future of their local assets at that level, and especially when it comes to commercially trading businesses that are open 365 days a year, shifts, money, alcohol's involved, and there's a huge attrition rate for communities who want to save their pubs. Most don't even try because they think it's a huge challenge, and on record, but it's not widely publicised, around about 10 to 12 communities trying to save their pubs fail to do that, because against them there's usually a developer or there's a recalcitrant freeholder that doesn't want a community to buy the pub, because if it happened at scale, it would draw into question the entire business model of the pub companies, and so on. So the issue is how there's evidence in the market. If we go into this in great detail, there is evidence in the way we behave right across Britain that people want their pubs to be saved. The barriers that are happening are understandable because it's a huge thing to do. People just want to go to a great pub. So the issue is how. I'm sorry, and there are 150 community pubs that have been successfully saved. Pubs which have been successfully saved by their communities. How do we scale? How do we make use of this knowledge that there's a burgeoning, wide-scale desire to have pubs saved for the right reasons, to have the right outcomes for those communities, against the few really pubs which have been saved? How do you scale them up? And the only way of doing it, the only way of doing it, is by having a pub company devised that's designed specifically to take advantage of this opportunity, which there is, where there are hundreds of distressed asset pubs all around the country, and we know that the communities around those pubs want to use those pubs, but they won't, and the pubs need to be substantially invested in. They need to be run professionally. They need to be stocked with good products that people want, and at that point, there's an opportunity to do a whole load of other stuff as well. And then it depends on raising the right amount of capital, as a normal big business was expected to do. You'd have to raise a lot of capital. You would never set up a. So how do you do that? So you have to find patient capital, and the only way of doing that in this instance, I propose, is through a national crowd fund, where we have basically a marketing exercise, a bit like, I don't want to advertise Omaze, but the Omaze house drawers. They're very successful, raising huge amounts of money, and people basically chuck 10, 20, 30, 40 quid into trying to win a house, which inevitably means most people will lose because one person wins and a few others get cash prizes along the way. But the bottom line is most people lose. So people are used to spending money on something good, but this would be a bit like the Omaze, but everybody would win, in that we want to raise £10 million and we want 1 million people to buy a one £10 share. So no one's taking any risk. And that £10 million buys 10 pubs, treats them properly, turns them into great pubs again, engages the local communities. There's a kind of proof of principle, at which point you're in the business of being able to scale up to say, let's raise £4 billion from a not from a hedge fund, from a pension fund, and then buy half of the pub sector and do it gradually.
Yeah.
So let's assume then that we can manage that. Let's assume that we can create a cooperative community, or we can create any form of community in which this funding is raised. Luke, can we sort of start to finish off and tell us what an ethical business in this form then should look like? If it's going to meet the community needs, but it's also going to be run ethically, what sort of characteristics should it have?
Well, it needs to be open and transparent in what it's trying to do. It needs to have built into its terms and conditions or its charter ethical objectives such as sustaining and rejuvenating communities. It needs to have all those aspects of internal business procedure which support employees built into its structure. So, you know, equal opportunities, fair pay, diversity rules, all this sort of thing. And it needs to be committed to some very basic moral directives, which I've written about at length, and I think you may have actually read my book.
Oh, yeah, I have.
So, you know, the most basic moral directives are, you know, look after the people around you, look after the wider community, and look after the environment.
And the bottom line is, it's common sense.
Yes, I know.
Does it need to have a strong union presence, trade union presence, in order to ensure that this proceeds?
I think you'd want to tie in with unions. I think that the problem for you, Mark, is that really you need assistance at a local authority or governmental level.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be so hard to raise the money independently, even with crowdfunding. I think it's a great idea, and I think you should give it a go. Even if you manage to save one pub doing that, then that would be you know, a badge of honor. But this is almost the sort of thing where you need such a focused attention and such a significant amount of money that it might even be worth talking to a local community about it. Sorry, a local government about it. You know, talking to a regional mayor. Who's that wonderful regional mayor up north? Andy, not Andy. The one who got fired by Labour.
Jamie Driscoll.
That's right. You know, somebody like that who has an eye for business and has an eye for the community, because it's marrying up those things, isn't it? Having a focus on community rather than a focus on profit.
You're absolutely right.
Can I just throw in there as well? In the last 12 months in Weymouth, we've had a new pub open called Dry Dock, and basically it's completely alcohol free.
Oh, really?
And he was an ex-alcoholic who's obviously gone through recovery, and he's looked in the community and he's noticed that, identified, you know, for himself, this is one of the issues that he found, was that everywhere you went, alcohol was the core of the organisation, i.e. pubs, restaurants, etc. And he wanted to offer something completely discreet. So it may be worth going, you know, having a follow-up to this and inviting him on to talk about how he created, how he got the community together, because it's thriving, it is so successful.
That's
and of
great.
course, and because it's alcohol free, there are no restrictions on when children can go in, which means holiday makers can just wander in there in the evening in the summer without having to worry about all the restrictions that are in place to prevent families coming together where there isn't food being served, for example. So it may be worth doing a follow-up. I'll try and get him on board and you know, talking, and he can give forward his guidance and how he went about it.
I think that'd be a really good idea. I've got another idea. I strongly think Mark should write an article in Dorset about your experiences, Mark, which are quite compelling.
Yes.
I think that would be a wonderful thing to do. If you wanted to, you know, help with editing it or anything, do feel free to contact me. I think that'd be a great idea. Second thing, I would point to my series of articles on phase 3, which are about ethics and business, and we'll put a link out with this podcast, won't we,
Great.
Jason?
Yes,
Phase
definitely.
three.
But yeah, I think that would be fantastic to see an article from you, Mark, and to explore this further, and also to have another podcast on the subject.
Lovely, thank you.
And we'll attach this podcast or videocast or what it's called to the actual article as well, so people can see you and you, Luke, and hear what you have to say and the sort of the gems of wisdom that you both have.
Great, thank you.
With any final comments? We're sort of running down now. We've got about 30 seconds left, folks. So any final comments that you think you need to make?
I just want to say, you know, again, I think Mark's a hero to devote so much time and effort towards communities across the country. It's a fantastic effort. Well done.
Fabulous.
Thank you very much. Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And my final thing is, what really surprised me in investigating all of this is that people in the cooperative movement who are very influential are as skeptical about the idea of a governance model which denies profit to anyone more than anybody else. They're as skeptical of it as people at the private equity end of it say, you're not generating enough profit, you won't attract us. And they all think if you don't have that extractive model somewhere, business won't work. It's bizarre. It's completely bizarre.
It is very strange. I agree.
Yeah. Thank you both so much for coming on 10 by 6. Absolutely fascinating, and we will continue this. Speak to you very soon. Thank you very much.
Jason.
Very good to
Thank
meet
you,
you.
Mark.
All right. Thank you. Okay.